by Tsai Ing-wen in a recent press conference. I would note, by the way, in this connection, and whether that last-minute surge of CEO endorsement and other such things at the end made a difference, that around 20% of the voters, according to one poll, made up their minds the week of the election. About half of that was either the day of the election or the day before the election. So while large numbers had decided as long ago as 6 months, I would consider that a pretty substantial number who waited till the end. The entire issue of cross-strait relations, as I said, I think was well, not the only factor in the outcome, extremely important. Let me talk for a moment about the 1992 consensus, which figured so importantly in this election. What is it? Does it exist? And what is its importance if it does? I'm going to give you, obviously, my answers, though we all know that there are other quite different views in the US, in Taiwan, in the PRC. I would guess, unless something's changed since the last time I was here in this room. The 1992 consensus is not a single document that's been signed by both sides. But it was a substantive agreement in 1992 that there is one China, although the two sides have very sharp differences over its meaning. Frankly, the PRC would have preferred then, and still now, not to discuss those differences in any detail, merely to acknowledge that they exist. But from the outset, Taiwan, then as now, under a KMT administration, did define its understanding of one China, and that was as the Republic of China. Quite relevant to the situation, I think, was the fact that at the time, in 1992, Ying-jeou was the vice chairman of the Mainland Affairs Council. And he has openly claimed credit, not for the name 1992 consensus, which we know was added a few years later by Suu Kyi, but for the substance of it. He's quite direct about this, and so his commitment to the 92 consensus is quite deeply rooted. As we know from his many statements, Ma defines the essence of the 92 consensus as one China, respective interpretations. And his interpretation of that China, as I say, is the ROC. He repeatedly articulates that interpretation for domestic audiences, but when he deals across the strait, he speaks in broader terms of the 92 consensus, because one China, respective interpretation irks Beijing, and he's not out to do that. I thought he, by the way, in his inaugural in 2008, he did a very clever job of putting these 2 points in his speech. He talked first about one China, respective interpretations, then there was an intervening sentence which was pretty neutral, and then he said, in dealing with the mainland, we're going to use the 92 consensus. So it was a little, the wording was a little different, but anyway, he separated these two things from each other. For its part, the PRC doesn't seek to define the consensus beyond saying Taiwan and the mainland both belong to one China. Now, again, internally and sometimes in its broader statements, it says the territory and sovereignty of China are indivisible. But because, and it calls all of this its one China principle. But because this is irksome to people in Taiwan, it also speaks generally about the 1992 consensus and it doesn't give its fuller definition. So in my view, the 1992 consensus does exist in the sense that there was a common position agreed by both sides that there's one China, even though they don't agree on what it means. And it's important because it provides the necessary political foundation for moving ahead on cross-strait agreements that would otherwise be beyond reach. And that started in 1993. Why the importance of one China? Just keep in mind that in his path-breaking speech on December 31st, 2008, Hu Jintao devoted a substantial portion of his text to establishing that his policy was fully within the context of one China as determined by all of his predecessors, starting with Mao. Together with his pledge to quash Taiwan independence in any name or form, he thereby fireproofed himself from fundamental criticism that his attitude of patience and flexibility was a sellout. It wasn't flexibility on principle, but it was flexibility on practice. Hence, although Beijing had learned hard lessons from past heavy-handed efforts to influence Taiwan elections, it nonetheless made increasingly clear over the course of this campaign that there would be serious consequences if a government in Taipei rejected the 1992 consensus with its one China core. Among the consequences spelled out in one way or another were the so-called Ceph-Aris negotiations, the forum between which the agreements have been worked out, so-called quasi-official agencies. Those talks would be suspended, so there would be no agreements. The likelihood was that the flood of tourists, and especially large-scale buying missions from the mainland to Taiwan, would substantially slow down, if not altogether stop. And the implementation of existing agreements could become, shall we say, less smooth. It also seemed likely that the so-called diplomatic truce, where there's at least in practice, a tacit agreement not to steal one another's diplomatic partners, that's been in effect since Ma took office in 2008, that would be abandoned, and Beijing would pick off at least one or two of Taiwan's partners. And to whatever extent there had been potential to increase Taiwan's international space, that too would dry up. Now, Ma took two basic lessons from the election outcome, in my view. First, as I've indicated before, that though his victory was impressive, it was not only was it far less substantial than in 2008, and that while part of this was because of the improved image of the DPP since the nadir at the end of the China administration, part of it was a widespread view that the Ma administration had failed to adequately address some of the important domestic issues that Tsai had raised in her campaign: social justice, economic fairness, and robust development. Ma, in fact, talked a lot about this after the election. He spoke of his mistakes, and he pledged that he would pay far greater attention to these issues in his second term. Although he noted he couldn't run for re-election again, still he was going to face the judgment of history. And he wanted, as he put it, to leave a legacy in society and the country's history. When one looks at the composition of the new cabinet, which took office earlier this month, even though Ma will not be re-inaugurated until May, one sees an emphasis on qualifications in those areas among the appointees. The second lesson he took from the election was that the people of Taiwan support his approach to the mainland. He was clear people had not handed him a blank check, and he did not intend to increase the pace of cross-strait relations. Still, as he had during the campaign, he saw the continued steady improvement of cross-strait relations, especially in the economic realm, as critical to what he termed Taiwan's march toward excellence. At the same time, recognizing the DPP had raised doubts among people about his attention to the political implications of his cross-strait policy, he pledged the following: "I will safeguard the sovereignty of the Republic of China with my life. I will struggle for the security of Taiwan and the dignity of the people of Taiwan to the end of my life. That is my most solemn commitment to Taiwan." Before talking about what might be feasible in the future, especially as viewed from the perspective of Beijing, I want to take a quick look also at the DPP's reaction to the election. As I mentioned, the basic reaction, aside from vowing to continue to fight, to be heard, and eventually to win office, the basic reaction was to examine the causes of its defeat. The focus was on everything from structural reform of the party and election strategies to better understanding the mood of the electorate and to more accurately reading polls. But the greatest attention has been focused on the party's cross-strait policy. In her post-election press conference the day after the voting, Tsai Ing-wen did return to the notion raised in the campaign that Taiwan must form an internal consensus on cross-strait policy, or else this question would continue to be the main source of division in Taiwan society. But for the DPP's part, she called for reflection on the party's policy toward the mainland. In the succeeding weeks, some prominent members of the party have called for it to move more to the center and to abandon the position that one China respective interpretations either equals or is the slippery slope to unification. Others have argued against any compromise that smacked of betrayal of the party's the party's position on Taiwan independence. In the end, in her report, on the Causes of Defeat, which the Central Executive Committee adopted unanimously a few days ago, as well as in her accompanying press conference, she avoided discussion of specific alternative approaches. Rather, she called on the party to seek a better understanding of the mainland through greater interaction with it, and to find a new approach to deal with. She said the DPP could only win the people's trust in its ability to govern by strengthening its efforts and capability to handle cross-strait relations. At least as a first step, a new direction in this respect was indicated by the incoming acting chair, Kaohsiung Mayor Ying-jeou, who even before stepping into that role has announced that she will promote increased interaction with the mainland. Nonetheless, to reiterate, vast differences of view remain about the party's appropriate principled position among the party's members. So while open debate may have subsided for the moment, it seems unlikely that this controversy is going to be resolved easily or soon, as in the minds of many DPP members, any substantial change will violate a central element of the party's identity, its very reason for being. Others, however, have come to the conclusion that unless the DPP makes some adjustment to close the gap with the KMT and with Beijing on this question, the party seems fated never again to succeed to power. Okay, as we look ahead, how is Beijing thinking about this? Well, as the campaign went on, while warning about the consequences of not adhering to the 1992 consensus, and this became, in my view, an increasingly shrill, if you will, point coming out of Beijing because they thought that voters in Taiwan really weren't taking them seriously. PRC officials at the same time held out a vision of a much richer cross-strait relationship if the current political foundation were in fact maintained. They spoke of further Taiwan participation in regional and international cooperation activities, follow-up agreements to ECFA, the Economic Cooperation Agreement reached in the Framework Agreement of 2010, expanded mainland tourism to Taiwan, eased procedures for Taiwan visitors to the mainland, creation of a market-oriented, institutionalized purchasing mechanism for Taiwan, the opening of PRC financial services market, and the establishment of cross-strait currency settlement mechanism. They also indicated they would help Taiwan businesses expand their markets on the mainland, and they would grant more patents to Taiwan products with